And since it is an ANU event, we recognise that though we're in Azerbaijan and we're dealing with a global question, we do have a particular focus, of course, on Australia, and so it's appropriate that we recall that Australia has been for countless generations in the care of its first peoples, and we acknowledge with respect those peoples, their elders then and now, and their custody of the land and all the elements of nature within it. We're going to have a very 360 engagement meeting this morning. But before we begin, I just want to test the cliche that's probably most uttered in this hall. Hands up all those who think we're not going fast enough in the direction of the new climate economy. Okay, the cliche, like many of them, is true. Most of us do think we're not going fast enough. So what we're focusing on today is what are the options for extending, expanding, accelerating the move to a climate-friendly economy globally and, of course, within Australia. The government in Australia has already got a quite expansive portfolio of policies, but maybe there are more coming. There are lots of ideas that are sprung on us from day to day. Yesterday, the investor group on climate change recommended that executive remuneration should be dependent on climate outcomes. That would have sent a few shivers through a few C-suites, I think. Earlier this week, in ASFI's panel on the development of the Australian sustainability taxonomy, we heard that taxonomies are not about compliance fundamentally, but about opportunity. And that sort of made me think about carrots and sticks, because as we expand the policy repertoire, what are we using as new instruments? Are they carrots? Are they sticks? How do you frame them? How do you think of them? Or in many ways, are they both? So what do we do to accelerate still further the move? And the context in which we're thinking about this issue is, of course, for Australia as a middle-sized, open economy that's highly dependent on trade, very different from some much larger, more autarkic economies. We have to think about the measures we take and their impacts on our trading partners, many of which are developing countries. So with that in mind, let's ask Kushla first to give us her responses to how we expand our policy repertoire to accelerate the move, the transition to the sort of economy we know we need. And then we'll get closer to the question that many of you will have come to deal with when we ask Frank to talk about the work he's been doing investigating the potential risk of carbon leakage and what an appropriate response to that might be. We'll ask Michael then to tell us how he sees that situation from his perspective at MIT and more broadly. And then we're going to keep Tennant till last. He's described on his LinkedIn profile by some anonymous compiler as a CBAM obsessive. So we'll just keep him contained for a little while we hear others. And then we're going to invite you immediately, those in the audience, to ask questions of the panel. I'm going to invite them to ask questions and make comments to one another. And if they find one of you is saying something intriguing or looking sceptical when you should be looking enthusiastic, they'll ask you a question too. So this is, as I said, it's going to be a 360 engagement event. First, Kushla, please.
This one.
Okay. Thanks, Trudes. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you to Howard. For those who don't know me, Kushla Munro, so currently in the role as the Deputy Secretary in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, and responsible for both the international and domestic climate change policies and programs for the Australian Government. And I think this is actually where the climate and trade aspects just fundamentally for me come together. So we can, and the panel will have different perspectives, but what I thought I would spend a little bit of time on is just thinking through, obviously, the objectives, and then just detailing some of the policies which you may not be as aware of, particularly some of the work that we're leading on guarantee of origin, which is really about the emissions accounting and traceability. So from that, obviously, the bigger picture aspects, we know we have to foster the international approaches that meet both the climate and trade objectives. And as we go forward, we want and need these approaches to be interoperable, particularly on the emissions standards. Again, for those smart people in the room, we know we will need this, and for Australia, we think about ourselves, as Howard was saying, as being, a very important trading partner. And so some of the language which gets used is Australia actually as a renewable energy superpower. And so we've thought quite a lot about what does that really actually mean, and particularly Australia as a trading partner and kind of shifting, what have been our traditional trading products to effectively zero low emissions products. And so from that perspective, Australia's role has always been to sort of champion global markets, free trade. And again, we absolutely value the multilateral cooperation, but are also, especially in this environment, thinking pretty deeply about what that would look like on a bilateral or regional basis as well. I think the financing, so there's a lot of work that's happening, in Australia, across the world, on the sustainable financing taxonomies. That's sort of critical when you're getting to this scale, particularly when you're looking at the trading of goods. So again, I'll just go a little bit deep on one aspect of this, and I know we'll come back into conversations with you and others on the panel. In terms of the broader suite of policies and options that we have. But one thing I just wanted to get a plug in on is the Guarantee of Origin scheme. So as it stands, we actually have legislation in our Parliament. And this is really about how we will measure, track and verify the emissions intensities of products. It actually started as something that we did on hydrogen. And because the molecule of hydrogen is the same, and so the verification of how that hydrogen is produced is absolutely essential if you actually want to understand what's the embedded emissions within that. But as part of what has been the expansion of the Australian government's policy in thinking about net zero transformation, it was extended, and it's both in the legislation, but probably even more importantly, budgeted for, so both policy and our clean energy regulator, to also apply it to the emissions intensities of green metals and low carbon liquid fuels. So we are actually going to be developing like a fundamental suite for the first time in Australia about how would you verify the emissions intensity. And I know that this is critically important in the trade, but I was lucky enough to join Minister Bowen as part of the first bilateral we had with the Chinese in a number of years, just a few months ago. And what really struck me as part of the bilateral exchange, there's a raft of policies that China is undertaking, but they were also very similarly looking at products and they called it the carbon footprint of those products. But kind of fundamental to that is the emissions accounting. And again, we have a rich history of actually working with countries like China on transparency and accounting. And I can sort of see there's a whole lot of politics that gets into it, but kind of the foundations here and things that we can do well is just the fundamentals of how you would actually trace what the emissions are embedded in any product. So I'll leave it there.
That's a very good intro, I think, for Frank to talk about whether, as Australia ramps up its climate action, there's a risk that that could be undermined by lack of climate action elsewhere, and whether that really matters in Australia, where probably our globally most visible product is Bundaberg ginger beer, or maybe Tim Tams. Frank.
Yes, good morning. I'm with the ANU and also lead the Australian Carbon Leakage Review. The status of the review is that the second consultation paper is out. Consultation is open until the 3rd of December. Government has not yet considered the preliminary findings that are set out there. The timeline is for the review to make recommendations to government by the end of the year, so that consultation process is tremendously important to us. Now, the background for all of this is that Australia has effectively a baseline and credit scheme in the industry sector, which of course provides a financial incentive to reduce emissions. And as is customary with schemes like that, you have these concerns of potential carbon leakage, which we interpret quite strictly as relocation of production, purely on the basis of differential policy settings or ambition in different jurisdictions. And so the task of the review is firstly to assess materiality of carbon leakage concerns, secondly to identify whether and what additional policy instruments could be deployed to address material carbon leakage concerns as they might emerge, and thirdly to look at selected issues of policy design in that process. So in a nutshell, the preliminary findings are that there are likely to be emerging carbon leakage risks for a small set of specific commodities covered by Australia's safeguard mechanism. We can go into detail about that, but it's mostly the high emissions intensity commodities that are strongly exposed to trade. On possible policy instruments, a variety of things are investigated. First of all, of course, the existing policy settings, which have baselines starting at 100% of emissions intensity, declining by 5% a year, declining by less than 5% a year, potentially for facilities that are particularly exposed to trade and are particularly impacted in terms of their profits. Secondly, and a finding there is that the existing settings are adequate for now, but that over time, as baselines decline, carbon leakage risks may emerge in a material fashion for some commodities. We then look at product standards, emissions product standards, where you might draw a line and not allow the sale of products that don't meet a particular emission standard. We have heard very little support for that option and cannot identify a particular instance where that would be, where that would seem like a reasonable policy approach to take. Then there's public investment, of course, and there's many public investment vehicles, including to support decarbonisation in industry. They have their purposes, they have their objectives. The review acknowledges the existence and purpose of these public investment approaches. However, our preliminary finding is that there isn't a case to recommend public investment as a systemic and long-term solution for carbon leakage concerns. It's difficult to imagine that as something that's comprehensive and also fiscally sustainable. Which Brings us to border carbon adjustments. Now, after a lot of consideration and consultation, including extensively in Australia's region, our preliminary finding is that a border carbon adjustment could be considered a suitable mechanism for some selected commodities, where Australia is an importer of relevant products from other countries, as well as producing those products in Australia. We identify in particular cement and a cement group of products, so clinker and lime, as potential early candidates for the investigation of border carbon adjustment scheme, as well as potentially other commodities, ammonia, the ammonia group of products, potentially down the line, steel, glass, and there's a few other commodities that are flagged for particular attention, potentially in the context of the 2026-27 review of the safeguard mechanism. Now, importantly, the review also finds that an export border carbon adjustment, so rebating domestic carbon obligations for production that is exported, is not a suitable policy instrument for Australia, firstly because it would run against the overall decarbonisation objective, and secondly because it would raise considerable concerns regarding compatibility with international trade obligations. Now, international aspects, free and open trade, rules-based international trading system is one of the principles that we place very strong emphasis on, including the principle of observing that Australia has, of course, prospered with open and free trade, with the region in particular, and as a relatively small and open economy, has a very vital interest in doing what we can to maintain that rules-based system and open trade. And so any such mechanism in the review's view would need to be a straight mirroring of domestic climate change policy settings onto imports without any shadow of protectionist intent or any impression of protectionist intent. Other principles, strong emphasis on the possibility on the goal of green commodity production emerging, right? So much less a view to shielding existing high emissions production structures, much stronger a view on creating the preconditions for investment in low and zero emissions production structures, okay? And then finally, economic efficiency, including in terms of facilitation of trade that promotes economic efficiency. Brings us to the last point. The terms of reference have required us to take a close look at plurilateral and multilateral aspects of all of this. And of course, long term, the most desirable vision would be a global system of harmonized climate policy approaches, right? Whether that's a uniform global carbon price, of which we might which still exists in many modeling exercises, but would of course obviously be a long way down the track. You could imagine international agreements for particular commodities or sectors. Equally, that'll be a long, hard road to get there. And so the long-term vision of harmonization does not alleviate the need for medium-term policy approaches at the national level. And finally, I'll end on that. We see tremendous opportunity in plurilateral approaches to foster emissions intensity assessment, which are an important underpinning for any border carbon adjustment, and potentially also the assessment of policy effort in originating countries, because you would, of course, acquit whatever carbon price or equivalent applies to production that is exported to Australia against that equivalent carbon liability in Australia that needs to be assessed somewhere. And we see great opportunity for such an assessment to ultimately be done under the stewardship of international plurilateral institutions like the OECD, like the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches.
Thanks very much, Frank. So, Michael, we've heard that Australia has a potential platform and some suggestions coming from Frank's review for very precise targeted actions, not a blunt instrument, but something very, very precise that takes into account Australia's trade exposure generally. How does this look from a distance in the global context?
Thanks, Howard. So let me reference some of these themes or takeaways from the... It's on, no? It's okay? From what? Yeah, the battery's probably getting. So this one's good. So I'll it's the location, you think? Well, it's as close as it gets, huh? Okay, I'll keep it. I'll chew on it a little bit. So, Frank, let me sort of reflect a little bit from the perspective. I'll start with the European Union. All right. Much of what you described in the sort of diagnosis of leakage and leakage risk assessment sounds very familiar. No? You know that academics have researched leakage risk in the EU and under the EU ETS to death, and the message has consistently been the same: retrospective, very little, but ex ante, looking forward, allocation as the leakage safeguard is gradually has to be phased out because we sustain free allocation indefinitely when the cap is declining to zero. Declining. All right. Yeah. This sounds more robust. Okay, good. It does become a challenge. So it is evident in ex-ante modeling that this becomes a challenge once the average carbon cost faced by energy-intensive trade-exposed industries goes from a few percent suddenly to 100%, the full brunt of the carbon price. So that assessment seems very similar, and I hear similar things from Canada, from the UK, etc. What I heard you sort of imply, that you're thinking of a staged process, also seems to me something that the EU took to heart. The EU ETS took a long time to sort of really get all the kinks out of the system. And so with the CBAM, it was, I think, a welcome thing that the EU Commission, from the outset, envisioned a phase process, a learning period, a transitional period, and then a gradual phasing in, also expanding sectoral scopes, expanding the vertical scope downstream sort of into higher added value products and so on. So really step by step. And the early sort of messages or the early observations we have from implementation suggest this is really, really important because the compliance rate has been quite abysmal in the first year. They've had to delay sort of the compliance deadlines, the infrastructure wasn't fully set up. So it's something really where the learning is happening very fast, and it just takes time to get both the member states, the authorities implementing this, but especially, of course, the importers and the producers abroad that need to supply data to get up to speed. So I think this sort of phased approach, starting with a good that's not quite as highly trade exposed like cement, where you don't immediately have a huge global value chain, very deep international value chains, complex value chains, etc., sounds like a very smart thing. There have been a number of issues in the European experience, at least, which is, of course, the most advanced, is implementing its CBAM now. Sort of crunch issues. You mentioned exports. I also want to add indirect emissions is a complicated one, given sort of some incompatibilities between the way that a CBAM fundamentally works and the European electricity market prices electricity based on the marginal generator and that, you know, the carbon intensity of that generator being passed through in the electricity price. It's not easy to try and accommodate those when you try to include scope 2 emissions. So this is something which is being done rather gradually in the EU, only starting with cement and fertilizers, only later with more electricity intensive goods. The value chain aspects, how far down the value chain do you go, is a big discussion right now in the EU because, of course, producers of slightly more processed, you know, slightly further downstream products worry that all you're doing is shifting the competitiveness frontier kind of to that threshold, and then suddenly they face enhanced competition as the upstream producers are protected by the CBAM. So these are all issues. Exports, I'll say very quickly a few words on. The same concern in the EU, that this would violate the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. It is a regulatory measure, unlike a tax that could be offset or adjusted at the border. So guided by the same, you know, motivation to avoid infringing trade disciplines and disrupting the international rules-based order, the EU is held back from doing that. But it's proving to be an absolute crunch issue for industry and trade associations. They worry tremendously that their exports into global markets, if there is no CBAM, will lack protection. And so there has to be some sort of solution for that. Maybe it will be investment in innovation and decarbonization, sort of targeted, but not too targeted, so it doesn't become an export subsidy on those sectors that are particularly export dependent. It's a discussion that's ongoing, and just yesterday the EU Commission published its report on the functioning of the European carbon market, in which it addresses very briefly sort of this export-related leakage issue. So if anybody's interested, you can find it online. It was released with a big press release. I'll say a few words on the international dimension. You know, in the US, some of the proposals we've seen, we know, of course, the UK already, some details, will have a different scope. There will be some fundamental differences in the design of the mechanism. So I think we have to expect that there will be heterogeneity, also with border adjustments, just as we've seen vast heterogeneity, growing heterogeneity with the underlying carbon pricing systems around the world. And some of the US proposals are even more different, let's say, even more vastly different from the EU CBAM. So we really have to look forward to a world where countries will choose approaches that are suited to their domestic circumstances and especially the domestic politics. And that brings me to one final issue. You hinted at sort of Australia would not want to implement something that double burdens imports from, you know, from abroad, from producers abroad, and would try to acquit or account for climate policies in countries outside of, so in other countries. This is, I think, tremendously important. Milan and I, we've been sending this message wherever we can, they with a report from RFF, I with a report with colleagues at the IMF and Cambridge University, that if you look at the CBAM and its real-world impact, that provision, which takes into account the carbon price effectively paid on embedded emissions and goods entering the EU, has arguably, circumstantially, had the greatest impact of all the sort of CBAM narratives so far in accelerating and spurring consideration of carbon pricing in a number of middle, income emerging economies around the world that have been talking about carbon pricing for years and years under the Partnership for Market Readiness, the Partnership for Market Implementation, and now suddenly, are rapidly moving towards implementing something by 2026, 2027, covering many of the sectors the CBAM covers. When you go into those jurisdictions and talk to the officials, of course they won't say, yes, the EU is making us do the carbon pricing, and that would be a sensitive thing. You wouldn't want that message necessarily to be out there. But they will admit that it changed the domestic politics because it was not only environmental ministry that was pushing for policy that is good for these countries. They know it is good. It helps decarbonize while generating revenue in a cost-effective way. I mean, it is economists not without reason have been saying this is the policy they should rely on, but it is politically difficult because you had Treasury often against it, or you had the Ministry of Economics, Trade, Industry against it. This political economy balance has changed, and so they're often quite grateful that they have an external impulse, if you like, that sort of really makes it sound more appealing to finally move forward with carbon pricing. And for Australian companies, if trade partner countries have a carbon price, that of course goes into what you said, that's the best way to address competitiveness and sort of asymmetries of climate policy that lead to competitiveness concerns. So do, in any case, try and get something in there that takes into account foreign climate policy efforts. All right. Now I sounded a bit obsessive myself, but let's see what Tennant can add.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Michael. So Tennant, you've been analysing and commenting on this series of questions for a long time. So, in 3 minutes, can you give us your take, please?
Okay, so I caught CBAM fever at a COP. It was COP21 in Paris when I heard Pascal Lamy and Jos de Belke as solid citizens in respect for the multilateral trade order land give a lot of insight into something that I'd previously thought, border adjustment, probably illegal, probably impractical, probably not a good idea if you could do it. And I went on a bit of a journey. And I have become a bit obsessed with the topic, but it's a very controversial topic here in the negotiations. And among the many things that are difficult this year is the discussion about whether there should be any discussion about unilateral trade measures, which is a phrase that mostly means CBAM. There are some other things in there that people are unhappy about too, but whether to discuss that, and if so, where. And that upset about border adjustment has a lot to do with very widespread misunderstanding of how border adjustment is actually likely to play out. And there's some unhelpful analysis that's being misinterpreted and maybe is a bit problematic anyway that's out there. Border adjustment, I think very much as has been outlined, is relevant to two forms of trade-related carbon problem. One is the fear that tough policy in one jurisdiction plus weak policy in another jurisdiction means existing activity shifts. But the other is, how is green production, low or zero emissions production, going to be viable anywhere? Investment in that production, how's that going to be viable anywhere when there is a bit of a paucity of markets where there is a green premium for steel or aluminium or a whole range of other products? And border adjustment is arguably even more important in that second dimension, creating viable markets for investment in clean production anywhere and everywhere, than to the question that has certainly preoccupied my members at AIGroup, businesses in manufacturing and other sectors across Australia, of the loss of competitiveness for what they do today. But that question of new investment is really, really central. I would also say that border adjustment is relevant to a couple of the dimensions of the finance issues that are the chief preoccupation of this year's negotiations, in two dimensions. One is, and maybe I'll just stick with the controversial, provocative statement here, CBAMs can be climate justice. Let's unpack that one a little bit more later, in that they can produce financial flows from developed to developing countries, insofar as developing countries price carbon in their exports to developed economies. They are effectively raising revenue from the developed countries. That is not the way most people think about it, but that could be quite an important dimension. The second thing is that in order to take up opportunities in cleaner production that are created by the formation of markets that do incorporate carbon value into selling prices for products, developing countries and anybody else need access to capital at a reasonable cost. And the difficulty in accessing that capital is already something that is under discussion here, but that's a really productive focus for discussion. Rather than we'll all be ruined if there's border adjustment, what are the ways in which we can cut the costs and increase the volume of capital available to places like North African countries, which have exactly the same superpower aspirations as Australia in supplying Europe? This has not been 3 minutes, but my recommendation to the negotiators from developed countries is actually to give some ground in the discussions here. There is a fight about whether to even talk about unilateral trade measures. Maybe if they shave off the word unilateral and just talk about climate-related trade measures in the Forum on Response Measures over the next couple of years, that would plausibly lead to people getting a lot calmer as they grew to better understand how this works, but also focus in on things like that access to capital issue or minimising transaction costs that are actually really productive areas to make sure that border adjustment functions well and is not unfair to any party.
Thanks very much, Tennant. So let's get straight into your questions, statements, comments. Who's first? Anna? No, I can't hand this one. Thanks. Thanks, Ollie.
Anna Freeman, Clean Energy Council. I'm so intrigued by the point that you made, Michael, in relation to, the developing countries now. This is the justification potentially for them to push forward with carbon pricing. Is the EU's action, and I think also the UK, enough to effectively lead to some sort of a domino effect across the global economy? Or do you need other major economies like the US to move into the carbon pricing or CBAM realm before we would actually see just, potentially this vision of the elusive global carbon price actually taking effect all through really the leadership of the EU?
So it's a fantastic question. So 15 years ago, roughly, 20 years ago, the hope was we would have a top-down global carbon price. We'd start with the Kyoto Annex B countries, and then, of course, in the Kyoto 2, it would sort of expand further afield. And, of course, that didn't happen. And then the EU, in particular, took a fallback position. Said, well, Joost Delbeke, in many sort of events like this, was saying the global carbon market will come from the bottom up through linking. And there were European Commission working papers or communications showing, sort of this nice trajectory from 2009, EU and some other jurisdictions, to then by 2015, when we'd have a US carbon market, Australia, etc. And then by 2020, when we'd have Brazil and China and others join in linked carbon markets. All this didn't happen. And why? As I mentioned earlier, because we've observed that carbon pricing systems around the world follow very, very sort of, let's say, idiosyncratic pathways to reflect national circumstances, national political economies, and deeply path-dependent climate policy legacies in a way. And so, in a way, there's been defeatism on that front. Like, okay, we may never have. It took 10 years to get Switzerland and the EU to agree to harmonize their systems and finally link. So if even those aligned and neighboring countries can't do it. Well, last year, earlier this year, actually, in Florence at the European Climate Week, I was asked to talk about linking and where things stand on carbon price. I said, if there is something that is driving some level of convergence, it is the kind of stick of CBAM. And you can observe that a number of the jurisdictions, I mean, if you look in the medium-term program, a planning document of the Republic of Turkey, they actually say we have to ensure that our ETS is compatible with the EU CBAM, which of course is based or modeled after the EU ETS. So there is already that sort of harmonizing effect. And you can see that China, in a document that recently announced the expansion of the national ETS, mentions that it should be modeled after more mature systems like the EU ETS. And there has, of course, been a lot of sort of bilateral capacity building technical assistance going on behind the scenes between the EU and these countries anyway. But this is, I think, what's sort of driving really some level of convergence. Will it be enough to kind of really spur linking down the road? I can't say that yet, but certainly I've seen more movement in the right direction in the last year or two than I have in the previous decade.
Resources for the Future have a recent report out on this, and one of the authors, Milan Elkabaut, is just here in the front row. Milan?
Thank you very much, Frank, for giving the opportunity. It is also a question I've wondered about myself, whether the EU was also a declining share of greenhouse gas emissions, whether it still actually would have enough clout to really usher movement around the world. What we have seen is very strong policy engagement, though, from countries that do not necessarily have the EU as a huge trading partner, at least in the goods that we're talking about in CBAM, the heavy industrial commodities. And even if you express it in terms of only a small percent of traded volume or a small percent of GDP covered, some of the companies that are affected, it will be a huge part of their business case. So usually I think it will be possible for governments to really find a very relevant audience in their own countries, irrespective of how much trade they do with the EU. That, for me, is promising in terms of the traction in the US. On top of that, CBAMs in itself, judging by all of the many discussions we're having the past 2 weeks, has this at least intellectual spillover effect. And even if it starts meaning many different things now from what the EU had intended as sort of an international component to a domestic carbon policy, the United States, as Michael alluded to, has a much broader definition, but just based on the mere difference in carbon intensity, that I think will also act as a further catalyst to start looking at how trade can drive further climate action, and also hopefully that it will be very beneficial once all of these measures are developed to think about different types of markets in industrial commodities. Ones which are distinguished by their carbon intensity. If that isn't taking place yet, then you will always have these competitiveness issues. But I believe CBAM, like and other carbon leakage measures, can help distinguish the characteristics of the market. Thank you.
Thanks, Milan. Now, Frank, Michael a moment ago described the CBAM as a sort of stick. Milan sort of outlined why, if it's a stick, it may be not a very heavy one, but do you see what might become an Australian border carbon adjustment, so a BOCA, not a CBAM? Do you see that as more a carrot than a stick?
Oh, no, we do not see it as a stick-like instrument at all, actually. We see it as a possibility to create green premiums in product markets, right? Because, it needs to be acknowledged how the way a border carbon adjustment works, right, is to allow cost pass-through in the marketplace, right? And this is, of course, what you want to see for an economically efficient outcome, right? It promotes substitution to lower emissions goods, and it allows low emissions produced goods to reap the market premium that exists because high emissions goods set the price in the market. Okay, so you would expect, the selling price of cement to increase somewhat. Okay, that needs to be acknowledged. Of course, as a share of the price of a final good, like a house or wind turbine, right, the impact is absolutely tiny, right? But at the level of the primary product, it may be quite significant enough to give an advantage to low and zero emissions industrial facilities, right? And so it's totally seen as a carrot for investments in refurbishments, in new installations that are low emissions. And the intent is to do that as a level playing field, right? No matter where that facility is located. That's the principle, right? Is it located in Australia? Is it located somewhere in Southeast Asia or in East Asia or in South Asia? It doesn't matter, right? It should have the same incentive for decarbonisation applied to it.
Thanks, Frank. Yes, please, next one.
Hello, I'm Akseli from Finland. As we know, the EU is planning to extend the scope of CBAM next summer. It's going to go to marine fuels and polymers and stuff. And I was wondering, how do you reflect that extension from the Australian point of view?
Well, one issue with the extension is there's always going to be a question very similar to the questions that were asked when the EU and Australia and other jurisdictions first established their categories of products or industries of concern in free allocation approaches or otherwise. There's always a question of significance. So there's a judgment to be made, and it's inherently a little arbitrary where you draw the line. How much carbon impact per tonne of product or per $1 million of revenue from product is high enough that you start to worry. But it is that same sort of assessment to be made in this context, except with the added element of that pass-through of carbon costs from products, input products upstream that are covered by an adjustment themselves. And so exactly how that plays out for different products in an economy is going to need to be assessed. But as a broad principle, if another product has a lot of value added associated with it or a lot of inputs that are not themselves particularly carbon intensive, it is likely that the competitive impact will be so dilute as to not be worth the considerable bother of developing a border adjustment and administering it for that product. So polymers maybe, injection moulded plastic toys made with polymers, no.
I'll take this as an opportunity to point out that the Australian situation is, of course, very, very different from the European situation in so many ways, right? Policy objectives, exact type of instrument, trade structure, and dare I say, approach to these things, including in terms of the balance between, trying to get it all exactly right with perhaps less of a view to transaction costs versus pragmatism, ease of implementation, and focus on the interests of trade partners, right? And so, we make that very clear in our consultation paper that we have a very firm view to something that would be easily implementable with low transaction costs, right? And thereby, including working with trade partner countries on implementation, perhaps broader programs on decarbonization, and that has ramifications for potential product coverage as well. And that's one of the reasons why the review identifies a really narrow set of commodities as potential candidates.
Thanks, Frank, for that strong cultural differentiation there. A question up the back, and then Fiona, and then we'll come down the front.
Yes, good morning. I'm standing up and short. My name is Nicola Rega. I work for European chemical industry. So thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. We are a sector which is covered by the emission trading system, and as was mentioned, we are looking at the possibility to be included also in the CBAM. Just to, as a few comments from what we are seeing, at least we can learn from the experience and try to see how does it work. Certainly, as long as the consumer is incentivized in buying the cheapest option on the market, we always find ways of risk of having circumvented one way or the other the CBAM. So it's really a matter of, I would suggest you to start working from backwards, like what is the market for low carbon products? What kind of tools would you need to put in place to help industry to decarbonize, and then work out afterwards how the CBAM is working out. If you do the other way around, the risk is that we are missing the industrial policy component in these discussions, which is forcing a lot of attempt to bypass it. You're mentioning, for instance, fertilizers as one example. Well, you can put the CBAM at ammonium, but then if there's incentive to get the cheapest ammonia, people will buy the cheapest ammonia in the market. If you move down, it's about fertilizers. So you want a cheaper fertilizer, yes or no? You need to discuss with the farmers. Would I like to have a more expensive fertilizer or not? In Brussels, it's a very difficult discussion to discuss with farmers. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. Let's move to Fiona, and then one more comment or question, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Yeah, so my name's Fiona Beck. I'm also at the ANU in the School of Engineering, and unsurprisingly, I was thinking about this in terms of a technology lens, thinking about the Australian border adjustment as more of a carrot. Is there any interest or benefit in looking at it less on the, for future deciding which projects are in and which products are out? Is there a benefit in looking at it through a easiest, lowest cost abatement point of view? So which industries do you want to focus on first to decarbonize? There would be an argument that, maybe we should be focusing on electricity intensive goods because we already know how to decarbonize those, and then looking at more complex, hard to abate sectors. Is that happening anywhere, or is it more from the other way, thinking about energy embedded emissions?
Hello, Lisa DeMarco, the CEO of Resilient LLP, a little law firm, and also an academic with Osgoode Hall Law School. Michael, we go way back on this issue. Talk about how this will be implemented potentially by a country that intends to use it to affect protectionism and the impact that might have on the use of the policy tool internationally.
Who wants to respond in the panel? Michael's been asked a direct question, but is there someone who'd like to respond to one of the other comments or questions?
Thank you. Before we go to Michael, and there's such a depth of deep knowledge on the CBAMs. Probably just goes to the broader policy point from the other comments and particularly questions from Fiona. So that all within context. So for Australia at the moment, really detailed work on sectoral plans. And so we have whole of economy measures like the safeguard mechanism, obviously thinking about the trading kind of perspectives. But that kind of goes to your point, Fiona, about, well, where do you start on this? And so, yeah, absolutely. We think about, electricity, that's like the core part, the electrification, the alternative fuels, things like ammonia, and you keep working down. And then I do think this is the whole point. There's a hybrid of approaches and the economic incentives. So that point about, well, what's the demand, what's the green premium? I mean, the kind of fundamentals for Australia and the guarantee of origin is because for both the critical minerals and hydrogen as the first two are really extensive tax production incentives that are paid. And so we really are getting, I think, quite a patchwork hybrid approach. And that's okay. That's kind of like, that would be my point, because it is trying to spark off and create that demand, especially when we know it is slow and hard going. And that doesn't mean you don't do it, but you've got to just put it all in context, would be my perspective.
Thanks,
Super briefly on the coverage issue. From our point of view, any border adjustment follows domestic policy coverage, right? Not the other way around. And so, anything about electricity in or out with a carbon liability, anything like that, that's a separate policy decision, right? In terms of, and with everything that brings with it.
That's a key point, isn't it? Let's keep coming, Michael, and then I know Tennant's keen to respond as well.
Absolutely. So thanks, Lisa. It's a frighteningly complex question. We all know that all these debates about trade measures, etc., are happening against the background of what is likely to be a seismic shift in the international economic order coming at us at great speed now after the election in the US. And that might well completely revamp the global landscape. And the market power and the political influence of this one country stands to sort of just, might is kind of ultimately turns out to unfortunately become right without being right on a fundamental basis. So the earlier question about the EU potentially with the CBAM driving a debate about carbon pricing and maybe even some alignment of carbon pricing, that potentially is lost then if we have some of the proposals that the US has been discussing in Congress become the law of the land, because it'll be so much bigger and so much more impactful or powerful that we'll not worry so much anymore about the EU CBAM and its really painstaking efforts to craft something that adjusts for a domestic policy and tries to be conform with the WTO disciplines. And what you recommended, that Australia should strive for the same thing. Try and observe the free trade disciplines in order to not add further fuel to the fire that we've been seeing already destabilizing a bit or threatening to destabilize international cooperation on climate, for instance. 3 proposals in the US. One is on domestic environmental costs incurred, an implicit carbon price. Another would be a performance standard that would price emissions above an average sort of benchmark. Those are the more enlightened proposals. Those are the more enlightened ones. Nothing similar to an actual carbon price adjustment, but the one that everybody agrees is the most likely to move forward in the upcoming political spectrum. And I think really many expect that 2025 will see a robust debate as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sort of tax abatements or tax reductions expire and have to be potentially reauthorized for another number of years, that this could become a part of that reconciliation bill. That does not have anything it adjusts for. It imposes nothing new on domestic industry in the US, and it designs the adjustment or the tariff that is imposed on imports from abroad based on sort of a projection of how we want to reduce imports from certain countries based on their national carbon intensity to a level so that it doesn't exceed domestic carbon intensity. So it is a very, very much more protectionist instrument than anything that we've been discussing so far. The one thing that gives me heartache is that many in Washington see this as the only way to have a climate conversation with the next administration and Congress. So it's a pact with the devil, sort of. Do we allow ourselves to talk about something that is potentially going to be devastating for so many other processes, or do we try and just sort of hold out for 4 years and not have any climate policy? I haven't figured it out. But so to answer Lisa's question about, I really don't know. And I think there's a lot of disruption potential in that question, Lisa. We'll have to revisit next year in Belém.
Oh dear. Tennant, cheer us up.
Look, I thought that was a terrific answer, frankly, and I don't think this is a cheerful add-on, but just in the world that we are now in, worrying about a sort of invasion of the body snatchers scenario where things that appear to be normal and respectful turn out to be secretly protectionist. Protectionism has arisen from the ocean and is stomping 400 feet tall towards the mainland to stomp Tokyo or everybody else. I think, no, that's a bit flip. We do still need to apply the microscope to proposals like the one being considered in Australia, like any further evolution of Europe's, to ensure that they do genuinely respect the spirit and the letter of the trade commitments that we have all made to each other. But also, border adjustment discussions might wind up being like the quietest and most placid WTO respecting piece of the trade conversation over the next few years.
Okay, well, it was sort of positive. One last comment or question from anyone, or yeah, please, and then we'll stretch it to two if you can be brief, please.
I will. I'm Martin Kenny from CRH. We're a building manufacturers company. Question is, cement's been mentioned a number of times. There are actually multiple types of cement. So CBAM's only successful if it's watertight. Which measures do you believe are important to prevent circumvention?
Thank you. And Milan, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Just something very quick on leakage. This discussion on CBAMs was triggered by the prospect of carbon leakage, but if you talk about the US proposal that Michael and Tennant talked about, if the US reduces its consumption greenhouse gas emissions, it might just sell these high carbon goods elsewhere. That's also leakage, so it inverts the discussion.
Thank you. We have less than 1 minute, so Frank, I'm going to ask you if you can respond to the question about cement.
Yeah, cement or any other product, of course, you want and need for any such mechanism a reliable method of actually establishing emissions intensity of imported product. Right? Just as you need similar mechanisms for domestic industry where carbon liability is applied. That point is, of course, prominent in everyone's mind who works on design and steps and down the track if government decides to go that way. And so in implementation, I think that's a very clear point and a well-taken one.
Go ahead.
I was thinking a little bit beyond that in terms of... I was thinking a little bit beyond that in terms of the potential for false declaration of what imported materials are, how carbon pricing is accounted for in the country of origin, how that can be incentivized and industry supported, but then recompensed through different mechanisms.
Okay, I think we'll take that as a statement.
Just one very quick comment there, which is default values are an extremely important piece of the puzzle here. When you don't have data that you trust declared at the border, a default that combines reasonable fairness with an incentive to report trustworthy data is extremely important to align incentives.
Thanks, Tennant, and bear in mind too Kushla's outline of the guarantee of origin as a good start. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks very much to the panel, but especially to the audience for showing this level of interest in what might look like a stick, a unilateral trade measure, that can actually be a carrot, another form of international cooperation to deal with the climate challenge. Thanks very much, everyone. Please thank the panel.